If hunters were to have a fourth spec, I'd like to see a spec that severs the tide of pets. I'd call it the Shadow specialization. I do realize we already have Shadow Priests in the game, however there are several specs in the game that share the same specialization name, and a Shadow Hunter feels like it thematically flows with what I have in mind for the specialization. So the idea behind the spec would be a DPS hunter that simply doesn't use a permanent pet. Now of course there are several hunters out there that would be entirely turned off to the idea of abandoning their beloved companions. But I have also heard from others that it would be nice to have at least one option to do so. If you look at any one of the current hunter specs, it pretty much goes as follows. Keep up Serpent Sting, use your specific spec, shot, proc, or abilities, use a maintenance ability, dump additional focus, and generate more focus, and of course kill shots somewhere in the mix depending on your spec. Honestly, I think the hunters need the same treatment that warlocks had in Mists of Pandaria, giving greater definition to these various specs. Thematically and mechanically, this spec would be very similar to the Demon Hunter from Diablo 3. It would shed some of the traditional abilities available to hunters currently in order to gain spec-specific abilities. Shadow Hunters would have a secondary resource, which would work just as Discipline does in Diablo 3. This is a slow-building resource, which would be consumed by certain defensive abilities. For traps, Explosive, Ice, and Snake Traps would be cleaved from the spec, leaving Caltrops and Spike Trap in their place. Caltrops would consume Discipline, which means you would have the option to dispatch them in short succession if you choose to pool Discipline, and Spike Trap would have multiple charges that regenerate on a cooldown, and Freezing Trap would remain intact. Disengage would be removed from the spec, replaced by Vault, another discipline consuming ability. Multi-Shot would be replaced for the spec by Rain of Vengeance, a targeted AoE which would be reminiscent of the old volley, but without a cast time. Shadow Shot would be the signature damage source for a Shadow Hunter, increasing their discipline regeneration rate. Serpent Sting, Cobra Shot, Arcane Shot, and Kill Shot would all be in place for this spec. Discipline consuming abilities would grant a buff, increasing all damage dealt by the Shadow Hunter. This would be the core mechanic to be concerned with while playing the spec, and the very thing Mastery would be based around. Caltrops specifically would be off the global cooldown, meaning you could drop it as much as your discipline would allow in order to stack it for damage increasing buffs at critical moments. The buff would adjust dynamically, so it wouldn't be possible to sustain a high stacked buff. The Shadow Hunter wouldn't have a persistent pet, and as such, abilities involving pets directly would obviously be excluded for this spec. Hunters, but more specifically Beast Mastery Hunters, have been able to provide any buff or debuff that a raid might be missing through their pets. Shadow Hunters would be able to provide any buff from a drop-down style ability in the same way that Call Pet functions. There are positives and negatives to this. You wouldn't be able to provide all of the debuffs, but the buffs you would provide would last 60 minutes, so it wouldn't be an issue if you were out of range of half your raid mid-fight. The talents would need a lot of specific cases for the Shadow Hunter, so I'll just go through them all very briefly. Vault would be the stand-in for Disengage in all three of the first talents. However, due to Vault being on a resource cost and not a cooldown, most of the effects would need to be reduced, as you would be doing them 2 to 3 times as often as a Disengage. Post-haste speed increase would only last 1.5 seconds, and the snare from Narrow Escape would only last 1.5 seconds. Crouching Tiger, Hidden Chimera would reduce the cost of Vault by 5 discipline. On the second talent tier, Intimidation would be a 3-second instant cast Fear for the Shadow Hunter. Binding Shot and Wyvern Sting would remain unchanged. On the third talent tier, Exhilaration would give the Shadow Hunter a damage reduction in addition to the heal. Aspect of the Iron Hawk would go unchanged, and Spirit Bond would just heal the Shadow Hunter regardless. On the fourth talent tier, Fervor could have Discipline worked in place of pet focus gains for the Shadow Hunter. Dire Beast could go unchanged, and Thrill of the Hunt would include Rain of Vengeance. The fifth talent tier would leave a Murder of Crows unchanged. Blink Strike would have a sub-talent that increases discipline generation, and Lynx Rush would summon a temporary pet to enact the same effect. The sixth talent tier would go unchanged. So that's my take on a fourth spec for Hunters. What do you think? What would you like to see in a fourth spec for Hunters? Let me know in the comment section below. Thanks for watching, and be sure to check out my channel for some other videos.